Every government in history has eventually reached for its citizens' wealth, not through theft in the conventional sense, not masked men, not broken locks, not dramatic moments you could point to and say, there, that is when it happened. Through law, through policy, through the quiet reclassification of what you're permitted to own, hold, or transfer, through executive orders signed on Sunday evenings, through capital controls announced as temporary emergency measures that last for decades, through the slow arithmetic of inflation that leaves the number in your account unchanged while emptying it of everything that number was supposed to represent. This is the pattern. It has repeated across every civilization that has ever faced the combination of unsustainable debt, political instability, and the need to fund itself through means its citizens would not voluntarily approve. And if you have watched this channel's previous videos, if you understand how financial repression works, if you understand why inflation is a feature and not a malfunction, if you understand what governments choose when they face the three doors, then the next logical question has been sitting in the back of your mind. If they can reach all of that, what can they not reach? This video is the answer to that question. Not theory, not speculation. Historical record, 5 categories of assets that have, across documented collapses, across multiple continents, across different political systems and different eras, consistently resisted government confiscation, not because governments didn't try, but because the nature of these assets made the attempt structurally difficult, politically costly, or practically impossible. The 5 are not a guarantee. Nothing in this analysis is a guarantee. What they are is a pattern. The same forensic pattern this channel has applied to every topic it has examined. Study the autopsies. Understand the mechanism. Ask the questions that those with a financial interest in the status quo cannot ask publicly. This is that analysis. Before we name the 5, we need to establish a framework. Because government cannot touch is not a binary condition. It exists on a spectrum. At one end, assets the government can seize instantly, remotely, with a single digital instruction. A bank account, a brokerage account, a pension fund held in a regulated institution. These are entries in a database. The database is controlled by entities that are themselves controlled by the government. Seizure requires nothing more than a change of number. At the other end, assets the government cannot seize without locating, physically accessing, and extracting them, with all the political, logistical, and practical costs that implies. Most assets fall somewhere between these poles. The question is not whether a government has the theoretical power to reach an asset. In extremis, governments have near unlimited coercive power. The question is whether the practical cost of reaching the asset exceeds the practical benefit. And whether that cost-benefit calculation holds across the range of scenarios in which the system breaks. That is the test each of the 5 must pass. Before naming the first asset, notice something important about what does not appear on this list. Gold is not one of the 5. This channel's first video examined exactly why gold fails in systemic collapse. Not because gold lacks value, but because value requires exchange infrastructure to become purchasing power. But there is a second reason gold does not appear here. And it is more specific to this video's framework. In 1933, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102. It required American citizens to surrender their gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates to the Federal Reserve. Violations carried penalties of up to 10 years imprisonment and a $10,000 fine, roughly $200,000 in today's purchasing power. Compliance was high, not because Americans were uniquely compliant, because gold, by its nature, is an asset the government could see. It was registered, traded, and held in forms that created records. The very properties that made gold a reliable store of value, its physical density, its institutional recognition, its established market infrastructure, made it easy to identify, locate, and mandate surrender. Every asset on this list was specifically selected because it does not share that vulnerability, not because these assets are more valuable than gold in stable conditions, but because when governments reach, they reach for what they can see. And what they can see, they can take. The first is productive land, not financial exposure to land through real estate investment trusts or property funds, not a title registered in a database. Productive land, soil that grows food, water that feeds it, physical territory that a person occupies and works. Throughout history, governments have confiscated land. This is not in dispute. But the historical record reveals a consistent pattern. Governments confiscate idle land, investment land, absentee-owned land, far more readily than they confiscate occupied, productive land worked by people who live on it and whose survival depends on it. The Soviet collectivization of the 1930s confiscated farms, but faced extraordinary resistance from farmers who burned their crops rather than surrender them, slaughtered their livestock, and created one of the most politically costly implementation failures in the history of authoritarian governance. Soviet records document that between 1929 and 1933, Peasants slaughtered approximately half of the USSR's livestock, 26 million cattle and 15 million horses, rather than surrender them to collective farms. The Bolsheviks had unlimited coercive power. The practical cost of enforcing confiscation against millions of individual farm families proved staggering. In Zimbabwe's land reform of the 2000s, the pattern repeated. Large commercial farms, absentee-owned, politically visible, easy to identify, were targeted first and most completely. Small subsistence operations proved far more resistant to systematic confiscation simply because the administrative cost of processing millions of small holdings exceeded the political benefit. The mechanism is consistent across cases. Large, registered, institutionally held land is easy to reach. Small, occupied, productive land that represents the owner's primary means of subsistence is expensive to reach. The government's calculus always involves resource allocation and the resource cost of confiscating from people who have nothing left to lose, people whose food supply is the asset you are attempting to seize, has historically proven prohibitive. There's a second dimension productive land has that financial frameworks miss entirely. Its output is consumed locally and informally. No transaction records, no regulatory filings, no paper trail. The vegetables grown in a garden, the eggs exchanged with a neighbor. These require no institutional intermediary at any point. The informal economy of productive land has historically been among the most surveillance-resistant forms of economic activity precisely because it generates nothing for a government agency to see. This does not mean productive land is immune. It means that among the categories of assets governments have reached for during systemic breakdowns, occupied productive land has historically been among the most resistant, and the most economically functional even when the formal economy has ceased operating entirely. The second is practical skills. A government can confiscate what you own. It cannot confiscate what you know. This sounds obvious. It is not. Its implications are more significant than most people recognize when thinking about wealth preservation. In every documented collapse, the Soviet transition, the Argentine crisis of 2001, the Venezuelan collapse of the 2010s, post-WWI Germany, the Lebanese financial implosion of 2019, a consistent pattern emerges in who maintained real standard of living and who did not. It was not primarily determined by who held the most financial assets. It was determined, with striking consistency, by who possessed skills that remained in demand regardless of what the monetary system was doing. The doctor, the mechanic, the electrician, the farmer, the carpenter. These people traded their skills directly for what they needed. Their wealth was not stored in any institution. It was not denominated in any currency. It existed in their hands and their knowledge, completely outside the reach of any policy instrument. In Caracas in 2018, a skilled electrician could exchange a day's work for food that a banker, with a full account, could not access at any price, because the exchange system that would have allowed the banker to convert his financial assets into goods had broken down, while the electrician's value to someone who needed their generator fixed was immediate, direct, and required no functioning institutional infrastructure. This is what the first video on this channel examined. The exchange assumption, and the belief that stored value can always be converted into survival. Practical skills are the asset class that exists entirely outside that assumption. They do not require exchange infrastructure. They do not require counterparties who accept your currency. They do not require any functioning system at all. They function in conditions where everything else has stopped. The government cannot tax your knowledge. It cannot freeze your skills. It cannot confiscate your competence. It can and sometimes does restrict licensing, but the practical knowledge exists regardless of whether a government recognizes it. There is a deeper point most wealth preservation frameworks miss. Skills compound in a way financial assets cannot. A financial asset held passively grows through the performance of an external system. A skill grows through the person who holds it, independent of any external system. In an environment where external systems are failing, this distinction becomes the entire difference between wealth that survives and wealth that dissolves. The historical record is unambiguous. People who maintained real standards of living across documented collapses were disproportionately the most skilled, those who could produce what others needed directly, without requiring institutional infrastructure to mediate the exchange. Their wealth was not stored, it was embodied. And embodied wealth cannot be reached by any policy instrument ever devised. The third is a network of genuine reciprocal obligations. This is the most underestimated asset in every financial preparedness framework, and the most consistently documented across collapse literature. In every studied collapse, the single strongest predictor of who maintained access to food, medicine, security, and basic services was not net worth. It was the depth and breadth of their genuine social relationships. Genuine is the operative word. Not transactional relationships maintained by financial incentive, relationships built on real reciprocity, the neighbor you have helped, the community you have contributed to. The people who would act on your behalf, not because you can pay them, but because the relationship itself carries obligation. In Leningrad during the 900-day siege, survival distributions followed social networks more closely than they followed financial resources. People with deep community ties accessed food through sharing systems that money could not buy into. People with only financial resources and no relational capital found that their wealth could not be converted into survival, because there was nothing left to buy at any price. In Buenos Aires in 2002, the barter networks that emerged in the weeks following the banking freeze were not open to everyone. At their peak, these networks involved an estimated 2.5 million Argentines, roughly 6% of the population, conducting real economic exchange entirely outside the frozen banking system. The entry point into those networks was almost universally a prior social relationship, not financial credentials. They were extensions of existing community relationships, people who had invested in their communities, who knew their neighbors, who participated in local organizations, who had built genuine reciprocal bonds, were embedded in those networks from the first day. People who had not were locked out regardless of what financial assets they had held before the freeze. A government can freeze your bank account. It cannot freeze a relationship. It cannot confiscate trust. It cannot seize the obligation your neighbor feels toward you because you helped him when he needed it. This asset is built slowly, over years, through consistent investment that has no immediate financial return. It is, for that reason, almost entirely absent from conventional wealth preservation frameworks. And it is, for that same reason, among the most valuable assets documented in collapse literature. The counterintuitive implication is significant. In the years before a systemic crisis, the years that look normal, that feel stable, that give no urgent reason to act, the highest return investment a person can make may not be financial at all. It may be the hour spent helping a neighbor, the consistent presence in a local community, the small reciprocal gestures that accumulate over time into the kind of relationship that, during a crisis, determines access to things that money cannot buy. This is what the Amish communities examined in this channel's first video understood structurally. Their resilience did not rest on any financial asset. It rested on reciprocal obligations so deep they functioned as a self-sustaining support system entirely outside institutional infrastructure. The network was the wealth, beyond the reach of any government instrument. The fourth is foreign-denominated or decentralized stores of value held outside the domestic financial system. This is where the analysis becomes more specific and more contested, and where the historical record is most instructive about what works and what does not. Every major currency crisis of the 20th and 21st century has been preceded by capital controls. The sequence is almost universal. The government faces fiscal crisis. Government restricts capital outflows to prevent wealth flight. Citizens who had not already moved assets outside the domestic financial system find themselves trapped. Argentina, 2001. The Corralito froze all bank accounts with 48 hours notice. Citizens who held dollar-denominated assets outside the Argentine banking system, in foreign accounts and physical dollars stored outside the regulated system, maintained access to purchasing power. Citizens who held only peso-denominated assets in Argentine banks lost access to their wealth for months and its real value permanently. Cyprus, 2013. Overnight, depositors above a certain threshold had a percentage of their deposits seized to fund a banking system bailout. This was the first explicit bail-in of depositors in the modern European banking system. It was announced on a Saturday. Citizens who held assets outside the Cypriot banking system were unaffected. Citizens who held only Cypriot bank deposits had no recourse. Lebanon, 2019. Banks suspended withdrawals with no warning. Depositors who had moved assets to foreign accounts before the restrictions were implemented retained access. Those who had not found their life savings inaccessible, a condition that, for many, has now persisted for years. These examples are not exclusively drawn from the developing world, a fact worth stating explicitly, because the most common response to this evidence from Western audiences is a reflexive that could not happen here. Britain implemented strict capital controls from 1939 through 1979, 40 years. At their peak, British citizens were prohibited from taking more than £50 out of the country. £50. For 4 decades, the wealth of British citizens was legally trapped inside a domestic financial system that was simultaneously being inflated away through precisely the financial repression this channel documented in its second video. The controls were not an emergency measure. They became the permanent operating condition of an economy managing unsustainable post-war debt. In February 2022, the Canadian government invoked the Emergencies Act and directed financial institutions to freeze the bank accounts of individuals associated with a protest movement, without court orders, without criminal charges, without prior judicial oversight. Accounts were frozen within 48 hours of the directive. The legal mechanism used had never been applied before. It required no conviction, no charge, and no individual judicial review. The accounts of people who had not themselves been accused of any crime were frozen because of donations they had made or associations they held. The significance of the Canadian example is not its politics. It is its mechanism. A G7 democracy with a fully functioning legal system froze civilian bank accounts at institutional scale with 48 hours notice using a legal framework that had existed but never been activated. The capability existed. The political decision to use it was made. The implementation was immediate. The pattern across these cases is not that governments seized foreign assets. It is that governments seized what they could reach, domestic bank accounts, and could not reach what was outside the domestic financial system before the controls were imposed. The critical variable in every case was timing. Assets moved outside the system before controls were implemented were preserved. Assets still inside the system when controls were announced were trapped. The average time between the announcement of capital controls and their full implementation in the 12 major currency crises, studied by economists Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff, was less than 72 hours. In several cases, it was measured in hours. The Argentine Corralito was announced on a Thursday evening and in full effect by Friday morning. The Cypriot levy was announced on a Saturday, and banks did not reopen until the following Thursday, by which time the legal framework was in place. 72 hours is not a planning window. It is not enough time to act. The only effective timing is before. This does not mean foreign-denominated assets are always safe. Foreign governments have their own interests. International asset seizure through legal mechanisms is possible and has occurred, but the historical record consistently shows that assets outside the domestic financial system at the moment of crisis are dramatically more resistant to confiscation than assets inside it. The fifth is tools and physical productive capacity. The distinction between the fourth and fifth assets is important. Foreign-denominated stores of value preserve wealth that was already created. Tools preserve the capacity to create new wealth, in whatever medium of exchange survives the transition. In every hyperinflationary episode, a consistent pattern emerges among those who not only survived the transition, but maintained productive economic activity throughout. They were not primarily the people who had preserved the most financial wealth. They were the people who possessed physical productive capacity, the machinery, the equipment, the tools that allowed them to produce goods and services regardless of what was happening to the currency. In Weimar Germany, farmers with agricultural equipment, craftsmen with tools, mechanics with workshop equipment maintained productive output throughout the hyperinflation. Paid in increasingly worthless marks, they bypassed the currency entirely through direct barter, exchanging real output for real goods. The tool is not merely a store of value. It is a value-generating machine that operates independently of the monetary system, and, like practical skills, with which tools are naturally paired. It cannot be seized without physical access, cannot be frozen with a database instruction, and cannot be devalued by monetary policy. A government can devalue your currency. It cannot devalue a functional lathe, a working tractor, a complete set of carpentry tools in the hands of someone who knows how to use them. There's a pairing effect between the second and fifth assets, the historical record documents consistently. Practical skills without tools are limited by physical capacity. Tools without practical skills are inert metal. Together, the skilled person with the right tools, they form the most complete and resilient form of productive wealth that collapse literature has identified. In every studied case, small productive operations, the blacksmith, the baker, the repair workshop, maintained real exchange value throughout transitions that destroyed purely financial wealth entirely, because what they held could not be reached by the mechanisms that reached everything else. Now, step back and examine what these five have in common. Before doing that, one clarification. These five are not presented in order of importance. The correct weighting depends entirely on individual circumstances, location, and the specific nature of the stress anticipated. This channel documents the pattern. The application belongs to the person who understands their own situation. Every single one of them shares one structural property. They exist, at least partially, outside the institutional infrastructure that governments control. Productive land, physically occupied, difficult to access at scale. Practical skills exist in a person, cannot be entered in a database. Social networks, relational, non-institutional, not subject to policy instruments. Foreign assets outside domestic systems, beyond domestic capital controls. Physical productive tools require physical access to seize, cannot be frozen remotely. This is not coincidence. It is the logical result of the pattern documented across 4 videos. Governments confiscate through institutions they control, banks, brokerages, pension funds, insurance companies. When a government reaches for wealth, it reaches through these channels first, because the cost is lowest and the access most complete. Assets outside these channels are not immune, but they are resistant to the first, fastest, and most complete form of confiscation, the kind that happens overnight, with a database instruction, before you have time to respond. The Manchester schoolteacher from this channel's second video did everything the system told her to do. She saved diligently, she bought government bonds, she held her wealth in the most institutionally legitimate form available, and the transfer occurred anyway, legally, invisibly, through the precise institutional channels she had trusted. The question this channel always ends with is not what to do. That is a personal decision made in personal circumstances, with personal obligations and a personal time horizon. The question is whether you understand the mechanism clearly enough to ask the right questions about your own position. The 5 assets documented here are not a portfolio recommendation. They are a pattern, extracted from the historical record of what has and has not survived when systems break. Some of them are conventional financial assets. Some of them are not financial assets at all. All of them share the structural property of existing, at least partially, outside the institutional reach that governments exercise most efficiently. The system is not neutral. It was not designed to be neutral. It was designed, as this channel has now documented across 4 videos, to channel wealth through institutional pathways that governments can access, monitor, and when necessary, redirect. Understanding that architecture is not pessimism, it is literacy. And the first question that literacy suggests is simple. Of the 5 categories documented in this video, productive land, practical skills, social networks, foreign assets outside domestic systems, and physical productive tools, how many of them are represented in what you currently hold? That question is worth sitting with before you close this video. If this forensic, pattern-level analysis is useful, if understanding how systems behave before consequences become undeniable is the lens you want to develop, this channel is built for that purpose. Subscribe if you want more of this depth. It costs nothing and signals to the algorithm that serious analysis deserves a wider audience. Share this with one person who would engage with it seriously, not for views, because these 5 patterns are more useful the more people understand them before they need them. And leave a comment. Which of the 5 do you think is most overlooked by people preparing for financial instability? And which is hardest to build? I read every comment. Your answers shape what this channel examines next. 4 videos, 1 framework. The system reaches through institutions. Build outside them.